Hello, all you wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people. Today I will be continuing my reading of The Demon King. We are on chapter 5, or chapter 6, Fellsmarch. The city of Fellsmarch, nested at the edge of the vale, a fertile valley where the Drinwater shouldered its way between the rocky cliffs of Helena and the rippling skirts of Eliza, her sister peak. The spirit-dwelling clan often referred to the residents of the Vale as Flatlanders. The Vale folk in turn looked down on the city of Delphia and the plains of Arden to the south. The Vale gleamed like an emerald set high in the mountains, protected by the frowning peaks said to be the dwelling places of long-dead upland queens. It was warmed year-round by thermal springs. It was warmed year-round by thermal springs that bubbled under the ground and broke through fissures in the earth. True Flatlanders, citizens of Tamron in the kingdom of Arden beyond South Gate, whispered that the spirit mountains were haunted by demons and witches and dragons and other fearsome things, that the very ground was poison to any invader. Highlanders did nothing to dispel the notion. Hans' teacher, Jameson, claimed that before the coming of the wizards and the breaking of the world, the 7 realms were one great queendom, ruled from Fellsmarch, ruled from Fellsmarch, grain from Arden and Burswillow, and Tamron filled her bread baskets, fish from the coast, and game from the spirits, and gems and minerals from the mountains, added to her prosperity. The queen and her court were patrons of the arts, and the city built music. Patrons of the arts, and the city built music halls, libraries, temples, and theaters all over the queendom. Though it had fallen on hard times in recent years, the city of Fellsmarch still hung raggedly on the bones of its glorious past. It was studded by elaborate buildings that predated the breaking. Fellsmarch Castle had somehow escaped the widespread destruction, as had the temples of the speakers and other public buildings. So when Han rounded the last curve of the Spirit Trail and locked down on the city of his birth, an urban forest of temple spires and gold leaf domes greeted him. Gleaming in the last rays of the dying sun, he couldn't help thinking it looked better from a distance. Lording over all was Fellsmarch Castle, which is with its soaring towers, a monument of marble and stone. It stood isolated, surrounded by the Drinwater, untouchable as those who lived within its walls. The City of Light it was called. Despite its long winter nights, there was even a period of time around Solace that the sun never rose at all. But on every other day the sun flamed over Eastgate in the morning and kindled Westgate at the end of the day. The Spirit Trail snaked down into the city and emptied into the first of the series of squares, the legacy of some long ago royal architect. Connecting the squares was the Way of the Queens, the broad boulevard that ran the length of the city and ended at Fellsmarch Castle. Han did not follow the Way of the Queens. Like it or not, he had business in Southbridge. He turned off into a series of ever-narrowing streets, burrowing deep into a part of the city the Queen never traveled to. As he left the way behind, the buildings grew shabbier. People swarmed the streets, pinched-faced and wary-looking, prey and predators. Garbage mouldered in the gutters and spilled out of bins. The air reeked with the mingled stinks of cooking cabbage, wood, smoke, prives of slope jars dumped into the street. It would be worse come summer, when the heat thickened the air into a dangerous soup that gave babies the croup and set old people coughing up blood. At Southbridge Market, Han managed to unload the snagwort for a decent price. Considering it was worthless, he could have sold it at Rag Market, but didn't want to risk it so close to home where someone might remember him. Leaving the market, he put on a street face and strode quickly and purposefully past the fancy girls and grifters and street corner thugs that would be on you at any sign of weakness or fear. "Hey, boy," a woman called, and he ignored her, as he ignored the glittering nobleman who tried to entice him into an alley. Southbridge was the affection that festered under the seemingly healthy skin of the city. You didn't go there at night unless you were big and well armed, and surrounded by big, well armed friends. But daytime was safe if you used your head and kept aware of your surroundings. He wanted to clear Southbridge before it got dark. To be fair, some might call Han's own neighborhood a dangersome place, but in Rag Market he knew who to watch out for and where they stayed. He only needed a few steps on anyone to disappear into the labyrinths of streets and alleys he knew so well. No one would find him in Rag Market if he didn't want to be found. His destination was the Keg and Crown, a decrepit tavern that clung like a muscle to the river's edge, the bank underneath. He had undercut by the bank underneath had been undercut by centuries of spring floods, and it always seemed in imminent danger of tipping into the river. His timing was good. The common room was just filling up with the evening trade. He'd be out of the way before things got too rowdy. Han handled Lucas's bottle to Matu, the tavern keeper, and received a heavy purse in return. Matu stowed the bottles in the back bar, out of reach of his more aggressive customers. Is that all you have? I'll have this lot sold in a day. Goes down smooth as water, it does. Have a heart, I can only carry so much, you know, Han said, pulling a pitiful face and working his aching shoulders with his fingers. Every tavern in Fellsmarch clamored of Lucas's trade. Lucas could triple his production and sell it all, but he chose not to. Matu eyed him speculatively, then groped under his massive belly for his purse. Extracting a coin, he pressed it into Han's hand, closing his finger over it. A prince's coin, by the shape and weight of it, called it girly. On the street, maybe you could speak to him, convince him to send more bottles my way. Well, I could try, but he has a lot of long-standing customers, you know. Han shrugged his shoulders. He spotted a plate of meat buns on the sideboard. His sister, Mary, loved meat buns. Matu, got any plans for those buns? Han left the keg and crown, whistling a girly richer, with 4 pork buns wrapped in a napkin. It was shaping up to be a good day after all. He turned down Brickmaker's Alley, heading for the bridge over the Drin water that would take him into Ragmarket. He was nearly through when the light died in the passageway, as if a cloud had passed before the sun. He looked ahead to see the exit from the alley was now corked with 2 bodies. A familiar voice reverberated off the stone buildings to either side. Well now, what have we here? A ragger on our turf. Bones. It was Shiv Connor and his Southies. Han spun around, meaning to beat it back the way he came, and found 2 more grinning Southies, blocking his escape. The meeting wasn't random then. They'd been laying for him, had chosen this place on purpose. There were 6 Southies altogether, 4 boys and 2 girlies, ranging in age from a year or 2 younger than Han to a year older. He'd have no room to maneuver in the narrow alleyways, no way to protect his back. It was a mark of respect, recognized of the name in Southbridge. That was one way to look at it. In the old days, he'd have had his seconds with him. He'd never have allowed himself to get in a fix like this. He thought of saying he wasn't with the raggers anymore, but that would just mark him as an easy victim, someone without protection or turf of his own. Hand's hand found the hilt of his knife and pulled it free, palming it, though he knew it would do him no good. If he was stripped of his purse and badly beaten, that'd be a lucky outcome. Hand put his back to the alley wall. Just passing through, he said, lifting his chin. Feeling a confidence he didn't feel, meaning no disrespect. Yeah? Well, I market different cuffs. Shiv and his gang formed a loose semicircle around Hand. The street lord was red-headed and blue-eyed, his face pale and beardless, as a fancy girl's, marked only by the purple gang symbol on his right cheek and an old knife scar that dragged his left eye down at the corner. Shiv wasn't big, and he was no older than Han. He ruled by virtue of his skill with the blade and his willingness to cut your heart out while you slept, or any other time. A complete lack of a conscience made him powerful. Shiv's blade glittered in the light that leaked from the street. His hand was scarred. He'd been badged as a thief by the Blue Jackets before he'd smartened up. He was the best blade man in Southbridge, and the only one better in Rag Market with a girlie, Cat Tyburn, who'd replace Han as street lord of the Raggers. One moment. You've been doing business in Southbridge, and we want a whack of your takings. You've been told, Shiv said. Hold on. You've been doing business in Southbridge, and we want a whack of your takings. You've been told, Shiv said. The rest of the Southies jolted forward, grinning. Joested led forward. Sorry. Look, I'm not a big man, Han said, falling into his old patter flash. Who'd trust me with that kind of plate? I just deliver. They settle up on their own. Product then, Shiv said, and the other Southies nodded enthusiastically, like Shiv would be sharing. Han kept his eye on Shiv's blade, adjusting his stance accordingly. Lucas won't pay a tariff or a dwab, and if I short anybody, I'm gone. Fine by me, Shiv said, grinning. He'll need somebody to take over. No reason it can't be us. Oh yeah? Han thought. Lucas in particular about who he partners with. Lucas is particular about who he partners with, but now wasn't the time to say it. All right, he said, grudgingly, as if giving in. Let me talk to him, and I'll see what I can work out. Shiv smiled. Smart boy, he said. That must have been some sort of signal, because suddenly they were all over him. Shiv's blade slashed up toward Hand's face, and when he paired that those on the other side seized his arms, slamming his wrist against the wall until he dropped his knife. Then an older boy, a southern islander, took to smashing Hand's head against the wall, and Han knew he'd been done. maybe for good, if the boy kept that up. So he went limp, dragging him to the ground. Shiv kicked him hard in the ribs, and somebody else punched him in the face. Nasty, but not deadly. Finally, he was yanked upright by the arms and held there. While Shiv patted him down, Han resisted the temptation to spit in his face or kick him where it counted. He'd still hope to survive the day. "Where's your stash?" Shiv demanded, turning out Han's pockets. "Where's all those diamonds and rubies and gold pieces everybody talks about?" It would do no good to tell Shiv that the legendary stash never existed, save in Street's tales. "It's gone," Han said. "Spent, stolen, and given out in shares. I got nothing." "You got these." Shiv scrapped back Han's sleeves, exposing the silver cuffs. "I heard you was a fancy boy." Cuffs. Seizing Han's right forearm, Shiv yanked at the bracelet, practically dislocating Han's wrist. Furious, the gang leader pressed the tip of his knife onto Han's throat, and Han felt blood trickling under his shirt. "Take 'em off." The cuffs had been Han's trademark during his time as street lord of the Raggers. Shiv wanted them as a trophy. "They don't come off," Han said, knowing with a numbing certainty that he was about to die. "No." Shiv breathed, his face inches from Han's, alive with anticipation, tears leaking from his damaged left eye. "That's a shame. I'll take off your hands then, and see if they'll slide over the stumps." He looked around at his audience, and the other Southies laughed in a ragged sort of way. "But don't worry, Stumps. We'll give you begging rights this side of the bridge. For a cut of the takings, that is." His laughter was shrill and slightly mad, like an out-of-tune song. Shiv withdrew his knife from Han's throat and continued. Alright. Shiv withdrew his knife from Han's throat and continued the search. Giving him time to think about it, he found Han's purse and cut it free, taking a little skin with it. Stuffing the swag under his shirt, he grabbed Han's carry bag and began sorting through it, tossing his trades on the ground. Han's spirits sank even lower. There was no way Shiv would overlook Matu's purse, and no way Han could make up that kind of money. It wouldn't be his problem after he'd bleed to death. But it wasn't Matu's purse that Shiv pulled out of the bag. It was Bear's amulet and its leather wrapping. "What you got here, Cuffs?" Shiv asked, his eyes alight with interest. "Something pricey, I hope." He unfolded the leather and poked it with his finger. Green light rippled through the alleyway, burning Han's eyes, temporarily blinding him. With an ear-splitting blast, Shiv and his Southies were flung back against the opposite wall like a rag doll's. Smacking the stone with a solid thud, Han went down hard, ears ringing. He rolled to his knees. The amulet, apparently undamaged, lay on the ground just in front of him, still emitting an eerie green glow. After a moment's hesitation, Han dropped the leather wrapping over it and slid it back into his carry bag. As he scrambled to his feet, he heard shouted orders and boots pounding over the cobblestone at the southern end of the alley. He looked back. A clot of blue-jacketed soldiers jammed the entryway. The Queen's Guard. Han had a history with the Guard. Time to be gone. He glanced at Shiv, who had heaved himself upright, shaking his head dazedly, surrounded by his cronies. No way to get his own purse back, but he still had Matuz, and the Guard might slow the Saudis down. It was a chance to come away alive. He'd take it. Han sprinted down the alleyway from the Guard and toward the river. Behind him he could hear screamed threats and orders to halt. He thought about taking refuge in Southbridge Temple at the west end of the bridge, but decided he'd better try to get clean away. He cleared the alleyway, ran past the temple, close fought his he cleared the alley, ran past the temple, close, fought his way through the line for the bridge, and pounded his way across. He didn't stop running until he was well into ragger turf. Then he took a circuitous route, careful to make sure no one was following. Finally, he turned onto a cobble street, limping over the uneven pavers. Now that he felt safe, he surveyed the damage he heard all over. The skin stretched tight over the right side of his face said it was swelling, and he could scarcely see out of his right eye. A sharp pain in his side suggested a rib was broken. He carefully explored the back of his head with his finger. His hair was matted with blood, and there was a goose egg-sized lump rising. Could be worse, he told himself. Ribs could be wrapped, at least, and nothing else seemed to be broken. There was no money for doctors, so anything broken would stay broken, or heal any way it pleased. That's how it worked in Rag Market. Unless Han was fit enough to climb back up Helena and put himself in Willow's hands. He stopped at the well at the end of the street and sluiced water over his head, rinsing off the blood as best as he could, and combing his hair down with his fingers, but didn't want to scare Marie. All the while his memory tiptoed around what had happened in Brickmaker's Alley. Maybe he was led. He'd hit his head after all. He could swear he'd seen Shivs take hold of the amulet, and then it sort of exploded, just as Bayer said it would. He could feel the ominous weight of the Jinx piece in his carry bag. Maybe Dancer was right. Maybe he should have buried the thing. But the fact was, if not for the serpent talisman, he'd be in a world of trouble, maybe dead. Ha, he thought, don't fool yourself. You're in a world of trouble anyway. He'd reached the stable at the end of the street, so there was no putting it off any longer. Inside the stable, Han sniffled the air experimentally. There was nothing of supper. Instead, it stank of manure, damp straw, and warm horses. He'd have to muck out the stalls tomorrow, if he could ever get out of bed. Some of those horses poked their heads out of their stalls and whickered in recognition, hoping for a treat. Sorry, he muttered. I got nothing. Haltingly, he climbed the old stone staircase to the room that he shared with his mother and 7-year-old sister. Han eased open the door from force of habit. His eyes flickered around the room, meaning to locate trouble before it came flying at him. The room was chilly and dark, the fire nearly out. No sign of Ma'am. Marie was lying on her pallet by the hearth, but she must have been awake because her head popped up as soon as he came in. Big smile broke on her face, and she flung herself at him, wrapping her skinny arms around his leg and burying her face at his wrist. Han, where you been? We've been so worried. You should be asleep, he said, awkwardly putting her back and smoothing down her tow-colored hair. Where's Ma'am? She's out looking for you, Marie said, shivering teeth chattering with fear or cold. She returned to her bed by the fire and warmed the threadbare blanket around her thin shoulders. She never seemed to have enough fat on her to keep warm. She's in the right state. We was scared something happened to you. Bones, he thought, feeling guilty. Where did she go? She's been out all day, off and on. Did you have supper? She hesitated, considering a lie, then shook her head. Ma'am'll bring something home, I reckon. Han pressed his lips together to keep from spilling his thoughts. Marie's faith was somehow precious to him, like a dream he couldn't let go of. She was the only person in all of Ragmarket who ever believed in him. He crossed to the hearth, pulled a stick from the dwindling supply, and laid it on the fire. Then he sat down on the thin mattress next to his sister, keeping his face turned away from the firelight. It's my fault you got nothing to eat, he said. I should have come home earlier. I told Ma'am I'd bring you something. He dug in his pocket and fished out the napkin with the buns. He unwrapped them and handed one to Marie. Her blue eyes went wide. She cradled it in her fingers and looked up at him hopefully. How much of it do I get? Han shrugged, embarrassed. All of it? I brought more for me and Ma'am. Oh. Marie pulled apart the bun and downed it in greedy bites, licking her fingers at the end. Sweet, spicy sauce smeared her mouth, and she ran her tongue over her lips, trying to get the last little bit. Han wished he was 7 again, when all it took was a pork bun to make him happy. He handed her another, but as she took it, she got a good look at him. What happened to your face? It's all swollen. She reached up and touched his face with her small hand like it was delicate as an eggshell. It's getting purple. Just then he heard the weary Clump, clump, clump up the stairs that said Ma'am was home. Hen eased into a standing position, bracing himself against the wall, concealing himself in the shadows. A moment later, the door banged open. Hen's mother stood in the doorway, her shoulders permanently hunched against a lifetime of bad luck. To Hen's surprise, she was wearing the new coat he picked up in Rag Market a week or two before, thinking it would serve him well the next winter. On her, it nearly swept the ground, and she had a long scarf wrapped around her neck. Ma'am wore layers of clothes, even in fair weather, a kind of armor she would put on. She unwound the scarf from her neck, freeing her long plait of pale hair. There were dark circles under her eyes, and she looked more defeated than usual. She was young when Han was born. She'd been no older than Han was now, but she looked older than her years. "I can't find him, Marie," she said, her voice breaking. Han was stunned to see tears streaking down her cheeks. "I've been everywhere, asked everyone. I even went to the guard, and they just laughed at me. Said he was likely in Gaol, that was where he belonged, or dead." She sniffled and bloated her face with her sleeve. Ma'am," Marie stammered, looking over at Han. "I've told him and told him to stay off the streets, not to run with the gangs, not to carry money for that old Lucas. But he don't listen. He thinks nothing can touch him. I'm dog dirt," Han thought. "I'm scum." The longer he waited, the worse it would get. He stepped out of the shadows. "I'm here, ma'am." He cleared his throat. "Sorry I'm late." Ma'am blinked at him, pale as parchment, her hand flying to her throat as if she'd seen a ghost. Where?" I slept over at Marissa Pines," Han explained, "and then I ran into some trouble on the way home. But I brought supper." He mutely held out a napkin with the remaining pork pies in offering. Crossing the space between them, she struck the napkin out of his hand. "You brought supper? That's it? You disappear for 3 days, and I'm out of my head with worry, and you brought supper?" Her voice was rising, and Han waved his hands, trying to shush her. They didn't need to arouse the landlord, who lived next door, and remind him they hadn't paid their rent. She came forward, and he retreated until he was up against the hearth. She thrust an accusing finger into his face. "You've been fighting again, haven't you?" "What have I told you?" "No," he said unconvincingly, shaking his head. I stumbled over a curb and fell flat on my face in the street." "You should put a cold rag on it," Marie said, from the refuge of her bed. Her voice quavered like it did when she was upset. "Ma'am, you always say that takes the swelling down." Han glanced over at Marie, wishing he and Ma'am could take their fight somewhere else. But when you live in a one room over a stable, there's nowhere to go. "Who was it this time?" Ma'am demanded. "The gangs or the guard? Or did you pick one too many pockets?" "I ain't lifting purses anymore," Han protested, stung. Nor diving pockets neither. I wouldn't. You said you were going after plants for the Flatlander market, Ma'am said. Did you even go up on Helena, or were you out running the streets the whole time? I went up on Helena, Han said, struggling to control his temper. Me and Dancer spent all day gathering herbs on the mountain. Ma'am eyed him narrowly, then extended her hand. You should have some money for me, then. Han thought of his purse now, in Shiv's possession. He'd still have Lucas's money, but, like he kept saying, he wasn't a thief. He swallowed hard, looking down at the floor. I don't have any money, he said. It got taken from me in South Bridge. Ma'am's breath hissed out, like he'd confirm all her worst fears. You're cursed, Hanson Alistair. You'll come to a bad end, she said. It's no wonder you're in trouble when you're out on the streets all day long, when you run with the street gangs, thieving and robbing. I'm not with the raggers anymore, Han interrupted. I promised you back in the fall. Ma'am plowed on as if he hadn't spoken. When you take up with ill-favored sorts like Lucas Frowsley, we may be poor, but at least we always been honest. Something broke loose inside Han, and when he opened his mouth, the words came spilling out. We're honest? Well, honest won't fill our bellies. Honest doesn't pay the rent. It's been me supporting us for the past year, and it's a lot harder without Slide Hand. But my gut... it's a lot harder without Slide Hand. Be my guest if you think you can keep us out of debtor's prison, taking in washing and picking rags. And if we do go to prison, what do you think will happen to Marie? Ma'am stood speechless, eyes very blue, her lips as white as the rest of her face. Then she snatched up a stick from the kindling pile and swung it at him. Reflexively, he gripped her wrist and held it. They glanced at each other for a long moment, married by blood and anger. Slowly the anger drained away, leaving only the linkage of blood. I'm not going to let you hit me anymore, Han said, quietly. I've already had one beating today. That's enough. Later, Han lay on his straw mattress in the corner. He could hear the soft, regular breathing that said Ma'am and Marie were finally asleep. Every bone in his body ached, and his face felt like it might split open. Plus, he was hungry again. He and Ma'am had shared the last 2 meat buns, but these days everything he ate seemed to evaporate before it reached his stomach. His mind bounced off corners like a mouse in a maze. He was no philosopher. He had few spaces of time in which to dream. He was not the sort to try to reconcile the wearing souls that lived inside his body. There was Han Alistair, son and big brother, breadwinner, deal maker, and small-time connoisseur. There was Hunt's alone, who'd been adopted by Marissa Pines and wished he could melt into the clans for good, and finally Cuffs. Petty criminal and street fighter, one-time street lord of the Raggers gang, an enemy of the Southies. From day to day he slid out of one skin and pulled on another. No wonder it was hard to sort out who he was. He shifted on the hard floor. He usually used his carry bag as a pillow, but he wasn't sure if he ought to, with the amulet inside. The Jinx piece occupied his mind. Like a toothache, what if it exploded and killed them all? Or worse, left them alive with no roof over their heads. Lucas's words came back to him. Keep the amulet, kid, and stay out of the way of the bears. If they find out you have it, they'll kill you for it. Finally, he pulled the amulet and its wrappings out of the bag, wearing only his breeches. He slipped down the stairs, past the horses and their stalls, and into the cold stable yard. Some distance from the building stood a stone forge built when there was a blacksmith in residence. It had been Han's hiding place since he was old enough to have secrets. Han lifted a loose stone at its base and tucked the amulet underneath, replacing the stone. Feeling more at ease, he returned to the stable and climbed the stairs, his mind working ferociously. Tomorrow he'll go back to Lucas, deliver his purse, and hopefully get paid. That might be enough to hold off the landlord for a while, especially if he mucked out the barn again. Sitting down on his mattress, he dug in his breeches pocket, pulling out the princess coin Matu had given him a lifetime ago. He turned it toward the dying fire, and the reflected flame picked out the silhouette engraved on it. It was Princess Reza, Amarena, heir to the Grey Wolf throne of the Fells. "Hey, girlie," he whispered, running his dirty forefinger over the image. "I'd like to see more like you." She was in profile, captured in cold hard metal. Her graceful neck extended, her hair swept back from her face and caught into the coronet. No doubt proud and haughty, as her mother, Queen Morena. No, Han thought sarcastically, it's far too much trouble to come into the highlands to hunt. We'll just have the deer delivered, even if it means setting fire to the mountains. Princess wouldn't have to worry about keeping a roof over her head, about where her next meal was coming from, or if she was going to be cornered and beaten in the street. Princess would have nothing at all to worry about. And that is the end of chapter 6. Thank you for listening and watching. Have a good day. Have a good night. Sleep well. And see you in the next video.